The subject of today's video is perhaps a difficult topic to define. It has been labelled a disability, an identity, and a disease to be cured. Autism is something that most people would have encountered in their lives without ever realising, and is mired by confusing stereotypes. In today's video, we will look at what autism is, how our understanding has changed over time, and the disturbing efforts to reframe autism as a contagion to be cured or even eliminated. It's helpful to start with a definition as to what autism actually is. Autism, or autism spectrum disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's characterized by types of behaviors and responses to stimuli. This can include different styles of communication, repetitive movements, and difficulty in dealing with bright lights or loud noises. Many autistic people have what are termed fixations or special interests. This could be a hobby, amassing collections, or a fixation on a subject into which they deeply dive. One of the more notable characteristics of autistic people is difficulty in social communication, although they can be quite animated when talking about their special interest. This can be seen from difficulties in maintaining eye contact to not understanding social cues. Autistic people can speak with a bluntness or lacking a social filter. This can often be misinterpreted as being rude or dismissive. Repetition and routine are comforting to autistic people, who benefit from structure and consistency in the confusing world through which they navigate. Repetition is also sometimes used to help navigate socially, by repeating back stock phrases to help with communication. But no two autistic people will share the exact same profile of traits or lived experiences. Autism is a spectrum and not a linear progression from mild to severe, rather a collection of different characteristics, which can perhaps be best seen in the example of the wheel. Autism itself isn't a learning disability, though as many as 50% of autistic people also have a learning disability. People with autism sometimes stand out, so as they grow older, they will develop what is called a mask. A mask is a subconscious or conscious effort to hide their autistic traits from non-autistic people. Signs of autism can present during childhood. If caught, a series of interviews, questions, and observations will be used to diagnose the individual. This will be done by a specialist team, and the entire process can take years to complete. Whilst many receive an autism diagnosis as a child, there are plenty of adults who receive a diagnosis later in life. Many females become aware of their autistic traits following childbirth or upon entering the menopause, with early research suggesting that this may be due to the impact of hormones on the ability to mask and regulate autistic traits. Some people, however, never obtain a formal diagnosis, but will reflect on their lived experiences and self-diagnose. This could be for many reasons. But for the writer of this channel and this script, Disturbance Brother, he thought a diagnosis wasn't useful at this stage in his life, but instead accepted that he is autistic. Autism as a diagnosis only appeared at the start of the 20th century. It is therefore difficult to know for certain the experiences of autistic people throughout history. When looking back, it is possible to identify autism as being bundled with other disabilities or other mental illnesses. This can perhaps be best seen in the condition psychasthenia, a mishmash of what might now be separately called phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or autism. Whilst it's not possible to diagnose historical figures with autism, there are examples of those who seem to match up well to the criteria. One example is Hugh Blair of Borg, a minor Scottish lord from the 8th century who earned the nickname the Daft Lad of Borg. He engaged in behaviours that could indicate that he was autistic, such as needing to wear the same clothes, sit in the same chair, and being oblivious to social cues. Hugh was disinherited by his younger brother John, who appealed to the court to push his own claim. John was able to show that Hugh was an idiot, which at the time meant a person permanently lacking what were deemed normal levels of reason and understanding. Terms such as idiot are no longer acceptable ways of describing people with neurodevelopmental disorders, but back in the day it was widely used as a catch-all term, and there were many more autistic people who were caught by this wide net of a definition. Many scientists such as Newton, Tesla, and Darwin are all thought to be autistic. They all enjoyed solitude, were deeply focused, and had difficulties with socializing. Mozart, too, was noted for using a set of facial features that he would cycle rather than than a natural change to his expression. He also struggled in loud environments to the point that he could be physically sick. Thomas Jefferson, the founding father and the third president of the USA, also displayed some autistic behaviors. He wasn't fond of eye contact and had difficulties with both public speaking and loud noises. His political rivals, such as Alexander Hamilton, would even point out his behaviors that were considered odd, and even called Jefferson expressionless. Although it is certainly interesting to retrospectively diagnose historical figures, it should not be forgotten that it is impossible to know for sure. But, looking at such figures, it's a helpful way to remember that autistic people have long been a part of history, and clearly looking from these examples, incredibly important people who have very much shaped the world for the better. But as our understanding of mental illness, learning disabilities, and neurological disorders increased, attempts were made to more accurately classify such conditions. The first time autism was used as a medical term was in 1910 by a Swiss psychiatrist, Eugene Bleuer. Bleuer coined the term in part of his description of schizophrenia, though his definition included what we would now call autism. Bleuer believed that autistic behaviors were a form of escapism from the real world. For a time, autism became linked with schizophrenia, with the term schizoid used in the 1920s to describe less severe cases of schizophrenia that could instead have been classified as autism. Around this time, Carl Jung developed his idea of the introverted personality type. This focused on the traits in autistic people that relate to social interaction and would go on to inspire others in defining autism. In 1924, Grunya Sukareva, a child psychologist from the Soviet Union, was the first person to comprehensively define autism. Grunya carried out her research into autism during her time working at a sanatorium. During this time, she lived and worked closely with autistic children who lived there, able to observe both the children's behavioral and psychical manners. She identified the key features, noted differences in behaviors between boys and girls, and detailed her findings in a series of publications. She described what she identified as schizoid psychopathies in childhood, but recognized the differences between that and schizophrenia, though in time she changed the name to autistic psychopathy. Her work went somewhat unknown, but one researcher who is thought to have read and used Grunya's work is Hans Asperger, an Austrian physician. Asperger's career began in the 1930s, witnessing the expulsion of Jewish colleagues and the rise of the Nazi Party in Austria. Asperger managed to position himself favourably with the Nazi regime. In turn, he was able to excel in his career, with more opportunities afforded to him. He joined several organisations that were affiliated with the Nazi Party, though he never joined the party itself. He worked alongside infamous doctors who pushed race hygiene policies, such as forced sterilization. Asperger himself actively cooperated with the mass murder of disabled children, sending them to Spiegelgrund's children's clinic in Vienna. This was part of Action T4, the secret program where the Nazis murdered those deemed life unworthy to live. They euphemistically called this involuntary euthanasia. Hundreds of children deemed unworthy of life on account of their disabilities were murdered at the children's clinic by gassing, starvation, and lethal injections. Many doctors, including Asperger, were well aware that children were sent to these institutions and never returned. In addition to wanting to create a racially pure society, the Nazis also wanted children compliant with Nazi society. This concept was called Gehmut, and Asperger framed his review of autistic children along whether the child's disposition was favourable towards Nazi society. It was believed that autistic children were incapable of learning how to be compliant, and thus were deemed a violation of the Nazis' pure society. Asperger is noted for his work in writing hundreds of papers on what he termed autistic psychopathy. Asperger worked to identify which traits in autistic children would be helpful to the Nazi society, for example, recognizing those with higher IQs. Those who could not learn to integrate and provide value would be institutionalized. This would be in facilities such as Spiegelgrund, where many would be murdered. Following the fall of Nazism, Asperger avoided any direct consequences for sending children to be murdered. As he was not a member of the Nazi Party, despite being closely aligned, he was permitted to continue his work. Asperger would later allege that he was under surveillance from the Gestapo, which was the Nazi secret police. However, there's no evidence for this, apart from Asperger's assertions. This has been seen by some as a way to distance himself from Nazism, or to present himself as an opponent to the regime. But after the war, his work on autistic children was largely ignored. That was until the 1980s, and the efforts of a British psychiatrist called Lorna Wing. Wing specialised in childhood developmental disorders, but Wing focused her professional attention on autism when her daughter was diagnosed with the condition at a young age. At this time, it was thought that autism was very rare and a disability that only affected boys. But in the 1970s, Wing undertook studies on adults and children, showing that autistic people were far more common. She found that 1 in 100 people were autistic, contrary to the belief that it was 1 in 10,000. With autism thought to have been so rare, there was little to no support for Wing's daughter. Faced with no other options, she delved into all work she could find on autism to learn how to best help her daughter. Her research was vital in defining autism not as a set of rigid criteria, but instead a spectrum. Much of her reading and research was influenced by Asperger, and in 1980 she coined the term Asperger's syndrome. This was a subdiagnosis of autism for those deemed high-functioning. However, this term is no longer used. Wing sought to reframe autism as a spectrum from those with complex needs to those with low needs, even going as far to say that most people will have some autistic traits. She is quoted as saying, "It isn't possible to draw neat lines between subgroups. I feel it is safer using the autistic spectrum, which is based on the one consistent thing: problems with the social instinct. We need to see each child as an individual. We need to understand their particular skills, difficulties, behaviours, and emotions." Later studies in the 1990s helped to confirm much of Wing's writings. As it became more understood, people with autism became a more visible part of popular culture. The film Rain Man, starring Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, won many awards for its portrayal of an autistic man, showing his difficulties socializing but excelling with numbers. Some famous people who have been diagnosed with the condition include Wentworth Miller, Chloe Hayden, and Sir Anthony Hopkins, who was diagnosed when he was 70. Some have sought to lay the cause of autism on environmental or external factors. In 1998, a widely debunked and discredited paper on a link between certain injections and autism was published. It relied upon a small sample size with no controls, linked common conditions, and relied on the parents to recall when signs of autism were first noticed. But the fraud went even further, with the doctor altering medical facts about the subjects. The doctor in question was struck off, and the Lancet Medical Journal pulled the paper. However, the damage had been done. News and media outlets spread the story, whipping up paranoia and fear over injections and anxiety over autism. This in turn led to outbreaks of deadly childhood diseases. In 2008 in England, measles became endemic despite 14 years of the disease being all but eliminated. Perhaps even more disturbing are the attempts to cure autism. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA, is a form of therapy designed to eliminate autistic traits in children and replace them with more socially acceptable behaviors. This is done by punishing the child for engaging in autistic behaviors and rewarding neurotypical behaviors. This could be done by forcing an autistic child to maintain eye contact for extended periods of time, rewarding them with sweets if they manage to hold the gaze for a period of time. However, if they fail to do so, they could be ignored, restrained, or even subjected to electric shock. The practice was developed by Ole Lauvas, a Norwegian-American psychologist, who, for over 20 years, applied the therapy to many autistic children. Lauvas's views on autistic people may explain his approach to curing them. He is quoted as saying, "You pretty much start from scratch when you work with an autistic person. You have a person in a physical sense. They have hair, a nose, a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. Whilst there are a few studies that suggest benefits to ABA, meta-analysis studies indicate it's less effective than initially thought. And then there are of course the ethical concerns of this practice. Many of those who went through ABA experienced PTSD as a result. Lauvas also authored a study in 1974 where feminine male children were subjected to similar treatment to prevent them from becoming homosexual or transsexual. While such homosexual conversion therapies are banned by many countries, no countries ban ABA for autistic children despite the condemnation and evidence of harm. In recent years, there has been a push to reframe autism as not simply a disability. The neurodiversity movement, which includes other neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD, seeks to highlight the issues caused by a society not built for autistic people in mind. It focuses on creating more inclusive and understanding societies, whilst pushing for better rights and respect. As of 2013, Asperger's is no longer something people are diagnosed with, and instead focuses on whether or not a person has high needs or low needs. However, some people do retain the diagnosis of Asperger's, as it was a label they grew up with and a vital part of their identity. There has also been a rejection of the need to cure autism. It is a key part of the movement to understand each individual's needs and ensure that these needs are met. The challenges autistic people face can perhaps best be seen in their employment rates. In the UK, around 35% of autistic people are in full-time employment. A report from 2024 highlights the barriers such as difficulty in the recruitment and hiring process, difficulty working without reasonable adjustments, and a reluctance to disclose their autism to employers. Many autistic people can live independently, while some require around-the-clock care. Others might need additional assistance but can live somewhat independently. Again, all depending on the needs of the individual person. Organisations like the National Autistic Society assist people with autism throughout their lives, as well as providing support to families. For those of you wishing to learn more about autism, their website is a great place to start. They have a magazine available to download which includes information about their work and contributions from autistic people, including poems. The history and diagnosis of autism will remain a disturbing part of our history, but it's vital to remember the importance of humanizing autistic people and recognizing the spectrum of needs, abilities, and the wonders they bring to the world.